Yesterday, the UK government announced a U-turn on its economic policies. So what effect is that going to have on the economy, and what's this got to do with a fiscal gap? I actually saw this explained on BBC News last night, so we're going to have a look at that clip, and I'm going to explain a bit more about what they're talking about on there.
Today, the new Chancellor didn't just announce a new chapter in economic policy, it was a complete rewrite. Of the £45 billion of tax cuts announced at the mini-budget, we'd already heard that reversing the planned corporation tax cut would knock off £19 billion, and the £2 billion for the...
Now, I actually think the explanation's okay. I think the graph is really confusing and the diagram doesn't really help too much. So let's start by what Faisal's talking about here, which is a funding gap. So what is a funding gap? We also call this the fiscal gap. So you could think of the government like running a household almost. They have expenses, for example, £100 billion. Now these expenses are broken down into two categories. We have mandatory and we have discretionary. Now a mandatory expense is an expense the government have to pay every year. So for example, the wages of nurses, they have to pay that regardless of the year. A discretionary expense is money that the government is choosing to spend. For example, on building a new hospital or building a railway or some other form of infrastructure project. Now, of course, the government also get income, and there's two sources of income for the government. There's taxation and there's debt. In terms of taxation, we have direct and indirect. Now, a direct tax is directly levied on someone's earnings or on a business's earnings. So, for example, income tax, corporation tax, these are forms of direct taxation. An indirect tax is levied on spending or a good and service. So this would be, for example, VAT. VAT is also what we call an ad valorem tax. It's an added value tax. In this case, in the UK, the standard rate of VAT is 20%. Similarly, with income tax, we have what's called a progressive tax system. Progressive meaning the more money you earn, the more tax you pay on that money. We also have government debt as a form of income, and we know that the government get their debt from bonds, and we've explained this before on the channel in a previous video. So we're saying that they're spending £100 billion off both mandatory and discretionary spending for a year. We say in tax revenue, let's say that they get £90 billion. And then the other, so there's obviously a difference here, the 10 billion can come from debt. And they lay this out in the plan. The plan is called the budget. That budget is then vetted by the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility. They basically check that the government's numbers are correct and they haven't just kind of cooked the books. So this was all fine. So what we had was a balance here. So we would have had, for example, zero, because their expenses would have matched their income. That was until a couple of weeks ago, Kwasi Kwarteng announced tax cuts. So the big tax cuts that were announced were to corporation tax and top rate of income tax, and also to national insurance. Now, just for some perspective, government tax, the main sources of taxes for the government are income and national insurance and VAT. They're the big money earners for the government. You can see on this diagram on the board now. So they announced all of these different tax cuts. The problem is obviously that reduces the amount of tax. Wind forward a couple of weeks, we have a new Chancellor. The Chancellor has rolled back those tax cuts. He said, we're not going to cut tax anymore. We're going to keep them as they are. And that's where we're up to in the video now.
Top rate of 45 pence, well, that was scrapped first. Today, another £7 billion in other tax cuts was scrapped, including things like a freeze on alcohol duty, leaving £17 billion. The stamp duty cut and the reversal of the rise in national insurance. But Jeremy Hunt went even further, not only cancelling the proposed early cut in the basic rate of income tax, but getting rid of it into the future. So going
And this is where this diagram gets a little bit confusing. So we have this minus 5 billion. What basically has happened here is the government had planned to cut income tax, the base rate of income tax. So what everyone earns after they pay, I think it's £12,500. They decided to cut that in the future. But Jeremy Hunt, the new Chancellor, has come out and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep it at the higher rate. And what that basically means is in the future, they're going to have more money because the income tax is higher.
Beyond reversing the mini-budget policies and leaving the tax-cutting Prime Minister with a higher path for the basic rate of tax than she inherited. That raises the Treasury £5 billion a year. Net that off, and you still have a hole of £12 billion.
Let's pause it there. So what basically is going on in this clip is we've said that, for example, taxation, they're now not getting £90 billion in tax revenue because they've cut taxes, okay? So in this case, they're now, let's just say, getting 80 billion, okay? If we assume that everything else has remained equal, so they're still spending £100, They're still getting £10 billion in debt. Now they're only getting £80 billion from tax revenue. Then we see down here, that means we're negative 10 billion. And this is the fiscal gap, because what's happened here is we now have a gap between our expenses and our income. One way to solve this is obviously to either increase taxation or increase debt or cut expenses. So either the government have to cut expenses, increase tax, or increase the level of borrowing. If we go back to the clip,
but the gap's actually grown by £20 billion at least because the economy's been hit and we face higher interest rates. And so all in all, that means a large gap, 30-ish billion pounds.
So why did the graph magically go up an extra 20 billion as we see there? Well, that's because the economic policies announced by Kwasi Kwarteng caused bonds to crash. People didn't want to hold British bonds because they thought they were high risk. They thought they were a risk of high inflation in the UK, so they weren't going to lend their money to the UK. That makes debt, borrowing, more expensive. So in order for them to actually get this £10 billion, whereas it would have cost them £10 billion 3 weeks ago, now because of the higher risk, investors want higher rewards, they want higher interest on that lending. So that lending is actually going to cost them, say, 15 billion. And in fact, the BBC has predicted here in this video that it's going to be £20 billion extra. Additionally, note, the economy isn't doing as well as it was 3 weeks ago. Businesses have been struggling. So that actually means the amount of tax they're going to be getting, for example, from corporations, from businesses, but also from income, because obviously if businesses aren't doing so well, people aren't getting paid as much. This is then going to lead to less tax revenue. So again, that actually makes this gap bigger, which makes the fiscal gap bigger still. And that's what's happened. So in theory, it should have only been a £15 billion gap, but now we have this £30 billion gap because the economy has changed from 3 weeks ago. So what does this mean for the UK economy then? Well, as we said, there's three solutions. Either they cut expenses, so they cut government spending. If they do that, then that is going to affect people's standards of living because, for example, they'll have to cut healthcare funding, or they'll have to cut funding to the police or the armed services, etc. They have to make these cost savings somewhere. That is going to affect people's standards of living, and it also can lead to a lot of unintended consequences. For example, if people are less healthy because they have lower access to healthcare, that could lead to them becoming less efficient, which would mean the overall productive efficiency of the UK economy would go down. On the flip side, they could tax more. Obviously, if you tax more, you take away from people's income, and that can affect their standard of livings as well. So the final solution then would be to borrow more money. But as we said, people don't want to lend to the UK economy right now. Now, we have seen some stabilisation in the pound, and we have seen some stabilisation in the bond market since Hunt made this U-turn. However, it's still going to be quite tricky for them to get this money through borrowing. So they may have to use a combination of all of these, but then spending cuts are very hard politically to get through Parliament and to get people to agree with. Additionally, tax rises, people don't want to see that. And debt can also lead to unsustainable debt in the long run. So in short, the UK is in a bit of a pickle. If you have any solutions, let me know in the comments down below. I might do a video where I go through them and give you my sort of take on them and whether they would work. I might not, we'll see how we go. But it'd be interesting to hear what you guys think. As always, thank you so much for all the amazing support I've had on the videos. It's been really great, so thank you. And I hope to see you all in the next video.